Good evening. I'm Matthew Swanson, the Associate Director of Choruses for the Cincinnati May Festival. On behalf of May Festival Principal Conductor Juanjo Mena and Director of Choruses Robert Porco, welcome to this live stream event. You join me here on the stage of Springer Auditorium in Cincinnati's historic music hall, which opened in 1878 to a crowd of thousands at the third Cincinnati May Festival. This building and the festival that inspired its construction have been vibrant cultural forces in our city ever since. At the moment, though, the stage and the seats are empty, and the hall is largely silent. Our usual cycle of rehearsals and concerts is paused, and in its absence, we are developing new ways of connecting performers and listeners. It is a moment of great uncertainty, and many questions remain about the future of art and culture. But the essential question is not, will art and culture continue? The question is how. How will art and culture continue? What will be our cultural response? And what forms will it take amidst such staggering losses of life and livelihood? As we seek these answers, history may prove an important teacher. Tonight, with the help of two leading scholars of American music, we examine past moments of national crisis and the cultural responses that followed. We first welcome Dr. Tammy L. Kernodle, Professor of Musicology at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Her scholarship and teaching explore African American music, both classical and popular, jazz, and gender and popular music. She is the author of Soul on Soul, The Life and Music of Mary Lou Williams, and she was awarded the Benjamin Harrison Medallion, Miami University's highest faculty recognition. Dr. Kernodle is the current president of the Society for American Music. We also welcome Dr. Douglas Shadle, chair of the Musicology and Ethnomusicology Department at Vanderbilt University's Blair School of Music in Nashville, Tennessee. Among other things, his research explores the role of the symphony orchestra and orchestral music in American life. He is the author of Orchestrating the Nation, the 19th Century American Symphonic Enterprise, and he is a leading expert on the life and music of Florence Price. Dr. Shadle is the recipient of numerous publication awards, as well as the Vanderbilt Chancellor's Award for Research. Dr. Kernodle and Dr. Shadle, a very warm welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us here for this May Festival live event. We're so glad to have you, and looking forward to the expertise that you'll bring to our discussion tonight. Dr. Shadle, I wonder if we might start with you. The title of tonight's event is American Music in Times of Crisis. Could you tell us a little bit about what we might expect to hear and see over the course of the next hour, and how this topic was decided upon by you and Dr. Kernodle for tonight's event? Looks like we're having just a bit of trouble connecting with Dr. Shadle. We'll see if we catch up in a second. Maybe while Dr. Shadle is reconnecting, we can go over to Dr. Kernodle. Again, welcome to you. Could you tell us a little bit about tonight's program and what we can expect?
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Matthew, for extending this invitation for us to have such a vital conversation in this time. What we can expect tonight is for us to take a glimpse of what has been this correlation between the cultural arts in these moments of significant social crisis. It is not unlike the period that we are facing right now with our current pandemic. What we have seen over the course of these past 2 months, in which most of our activity and social engagement has ended, is that creatives around the world have found ways in which to unify us but also to elevate our spirits in these virtual formats. And so from jazz musicians to concert musicians to our popular music musicians, they all have rallied in some way, shape, or form to engage us and lift our spirits.
Dr. Shadle, welcome
Thank
to
you.
you. Glad to see you online here. Can you tell us
Yeah,
a little bit
thanks.
about the process of developing this program?
Yeah, and my apologies. I was having a tech crisis as we speak, so I'm sweating a little bit here, but I think I've got it all figured out. Yeah, so as Dr. Kernodle said, we really want to focus on aspects of music history where moments of crisis have allowed people to come together. But part of a crisis moment, I think, is that it really has three parts. There's before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis. And I think what we're talking about as we unfold this narrative of American music history is that how often a relationship develops between what happens after the crisis. A relationship will obviously develop with what happened during the crisis, but then there's a historical memory of what happened before, what was happening before the crisis as well. And so each kind of moment or era that we were talking about has some elements of pastness, presentness, and aspects of the future. And I really think that we've already started to feel that with the COVID-19 pandemic, where my colleagues and I have started to refer to the before times, as what was happening at school or at work or in the world before things really hit. And I think as we move forward, of course, arts organizations will have to figure out what to do next. But then also, I think part of that process is rethinking your relationship to the past. And so what we're going to talk about today is really a narrative of American music that foregrounds certain crisis moments and certain experiences of crisis that has allowed musicians and creative people to rethink their relationships to past, present, and future over a series of generations. And so I think the playlist that we've come up with and the stories that we're going to tell will be really powerful and will be meaningful ultimately for people to think about their own place in the world as we move forward.
Excellent. Just before I hand the floor over to the both of you, I'll remind all the viewers at home that we will be taking questions at the end. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation, and we'll be asking them of our two experts at the conclusion of this evening's event. And now, without further ado, Dr. Shadle and Dr. Kernodle.
We want to start tonight's conversation and our musical journey by going back to a time in American history where very much like this time, there was much uncertainty and instability. That period I'm talking about is the period called Reconstruction, which is a historical period that is generally defined by the years 1865 to 1877. The period of Reconstruction is not simply about the reconstruction of the South following the Civil War, but it encompasses many more social and political phenomenon that over the course of those years came to shape also our sense of musical life and our identity as Americans. The period of Reconstruction is oftentimes defined by the ending of the Civil War itself, but it is also defined by the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the emergence of over 1 million freedmen, former slaves, being freed upon a southern landscape that is in ruins, and a financial system and way of life that is no longer in existence. It is during this period that music became an important part of this soundscape. And so one of the first sounds that we hear emerging in the new world that is created out of Reconstruction and the end of the Civil War and the carnage that exemplified the Civil War was the arranged spiritual. And so I want to point as our first discussion of music in the time of social crisis, in particular to the life of Ella Shepherd, who in many ways, as an African American woman, as a free woman at the time of Reconstruction, embodied what was the hope, what was the uncertainty, and what was the promise of the future. Ella Shepherd was born in 1851 on Andrew Jackson's plantation Hermitage. And her father was able to purchase his freedom and ultimately tried to free Ella's mother and Ella. Ella's mother, Sarah's slave owners refused to free her. And so out of this, Sarah grew quite despondent. And it is rumored that at one point in time attempted to kill Ella and herself, but was persuaded by an older slave to not kill the child because the child would prophetically have a higher calling upon her life. But when we move past that story, Ella Shepherd's story provides for us a glimpse of what it was to be a free woman in 19th century America, pre-Civil War America. Because her father purchased her freedom, but in 1856, following the sale of his first wife, Sarah, to a plantation in Mississippi, he and Ella fled to Cincinnati, Ohio. They were, in fact, inspired to move to Cincinnati because of a race riot that took place in Nashville, Tennessee in 1856. It was here in Cincinnati that they reestablished their life. Ella was actually trained formally as a musician. She showed significant promise as a young woman, as a prodigy, was a prodigy from most accounts. And so she took formal lessons in piano and also in voice. Her father died somewhere around 1866, and as a result of her talent, Ella was able to help economically sustain her household, which included her stepmother and a stepsister. At some point in time, around 1868, she returns back to Nashville to teach at one of the many freedom schools that opened north of Nashville. The Freedom School phenomenon was just one of the markers of how newly freed slaves in the South, following the end of the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery, sought to reinsert themselves into this new society that was being etched out. Literacy was at the forefront of them being acclimated into this new world. And so going to this freedom school as a teacher provided Ella not only the ability to empower other freedmen, but it also brought her into close proximity with the Fisk School, free school for coloreds, which became the Fisk University. And so some point in time around 1870, Ella Shepherd enrolled in the Fisk Colored School. And her musical talent became apparent very quickly. And so as a result of that musical talent and the talent of the other students there at Fisk, the Fisk Jubilee Singers, a small ensemble of 9 singers, was formed. And in 1871, they set out on a tour. Their first stop was Cincinnati. Their first concert was given here. And just as a way of marking what we are talking about in terms of social crisis, the $50 that they earned during that particular concert, they immediately donated to the victims of the 1871 Chicago fire. And so their efforts on the concert stage, their singing of European concert music, as well as the songs of the slave cabins, fueled one of the first benevolent efforts on the part of freedmen. But what's most important that I want us to understand from this conversation is that as we are entering Reconstruction, one of the first new sounds of this soundscape of New America is a sound that is drawn from the praise houses and the fields of the slaves, reimagined in a European concert sound. The positioning of the Fifth Jubilee Singers on American stages in 1871 as they toured Ohio and Pennsylvania and most of the Midwest was the beginning of an aesthetic, beginning of a sound that would be rooted in the cloth of America. Ella Shepherd is important to this story because Ella Shepherd is a key figure in terms of the evolution of the spiritual in this concert vein, the making of a new sound of this spiritual. Ella Shepherd's talent is what buoyed the efforts of the Fifth Jubilee Singers. She often accompanied the choir on piano. She led most of the rehearsals. She also transcribed and compiled many of the spiritual melodies that they popularized and made famous. And in 1873, when this group of young singers embarks on a second tour, that tour will take them to Europe. And so the spiritual will be one of the first markers of true American sound on a global stage because of the voices of these freedmen. And so as a first musical example, I want to offer the spiritual Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which has a direct connection with Ella Shepherd. We know that this particular spiritual entered the Fifth Jubilee Singers repertory around about 1875. There's much discussion about the origins of this spiritual, but we do know that it was a personal favorite of Ella Shepherd. And the last song that was sung to her mother on her mother's deathbed in 1950. So can we hear Swing Low, Sweet Chariot?
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me. And what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. A band of angels coming after me. Coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. If you get there before I do.
So Ella Shepherd and the Fifth Jubilee Singers, in establishing this paradigm of the arranged spiritual, offered a counterpoint to the conceptions of sonic blackness and black music that were already being consumed by Americans in the 19th century. that initial consumption surrounded the band music of Francis Johnson and William Poe and those Philadelphia composers who came to prominence in the early 19th century, but also the Black minstrel troupes that had begun to traverse the United States in the 1860s. In both of those cases, what you had was a very elemental representation of Black culture, identity, and musical life, where these arranged spirituals offered a much more expansive view of Black intelligence, of Black hope, and of the aspirations of Blacks in changing or altering what was this lived experience of slavery.
Well, and I'd like to pick it up there a little bit because, you know, it was just after the Civil War that we start to see the first collections of music of enslaved people collected and produced by white musicians and collectors as well in the late 1860s. And so there was this budding interest, even among the more elite class of whites, during the Reconstruction period in this music. But if we think about sort of the larger classical music culture, the European derived classical music culture, of which the city of Cincinnati played a very central role during this time, we can think about the influence of German music making, for instance, Beethoven symphonies, Handel's choral works being readily absorbed by German-speaking people and brought to the United States far earlier in the century. These German singing societies, of which Cincinnati had a really great one, became the start of really the choral music culture within sort of white classical music making. And the Cincinnati May Festival itself, when it was founded in the 1870s, became one of the best and greatest of these organizations that supported essentially European derived music. Well, during the same period that Dr. Kernodle is talking about, there are American-born composers of symphonic works and operatic works who are thinking about, well, what can I do to put an American spin on this? And this question became one of the central points of discussion throughout the second half of the 19th century and even into the 20th century, as you'll hear. And there was a lot of debate about, you know, what would it mean to write an American music? Is it to copy the Beethovenian style but do it better? Is it to copy the progressive style of someone like Richard Wagner and make it very sensual and emotional and somehow do that better than the Europeans? And a lot of people thought that way. They thought that, okay, if we go over to Europe and study the symphonic and operatic masterworks of the time, then we can come back to the United States and just do it even better than the Europeans could, so kind of out-European the Europeans. Well, there was a sort of a third stream of people who believed that American composers should draw from what they considered the storehouse of folk song to be an inspiration for their classical music style. And in fact, one of the first classical pieces written after the Civil War based on music of people of African descent was composed in Cincinnati by a composer named John Brookhoven in 1884. A friend of his, actually a friend of a friend of his, was living in New Orleans and had collected some folk songs of and street cries of people living there in the late 1870s and mailed these through the mail to this friend. And the friend asked Brookhoven if he could compose a piece based on these folk songs, and so he did. And that piece, believe it or not, had a lifespan that extended into the 1930s. So it was written in 1884. John Philip Sousa eventually took it on tour in 1910, and then it was published in 1929 and even had a little lifespan beyond that. So some of the music that was written early in this period that we're talking about did become very significant. But the biggest sort of flashpoint of all was the status of music by former enslaved people. And the question that white communities wanted to answer was, is it even American or is it not? And from our perspective today, it seems, it seems so obvious that it was American. But there was, we have to remember that we're dealing with a time when people thought people of African descent were less than human, or were a sort of different, a different breed of human, and had kind of subhuman capacities for learning. And so, if you held these deeply racist beliefs, then clearly you didn't think that music of enslaved people could be the foundation of a musical style. And so there was a little bit of discussion about this, is this music even American? Is it high class enough to be considered worthy of incorporation into classical music? Well, this debate really exploded when the Bohemian composer Antonin Dvorak came to the United States in 1892. And so this is a bit later from what Dr. Kernodle was talking about. And Dvorak famously said in May of 1893 that he thinks the only foundation of a national school of classical composition will come from studying and learning from this music. Well, immediately after this pronouncement was published in newspapers, you have people from 10 different sides of the argument writing in their perspective on this. Everything from Dvorak is Bohemian, he has no idea what he's talking about. They're saying that he thinks that classical music should be based on minstrel tunes. They said that, well, didn't white people write this music in the first place? Didn't Stephen Foster write all the spirituals? This kind of very misguided racist responses. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you get people saying, oh, well, he's really onto something here. This music was born on American soil, and that should be enough for us to think of it as American. And then, of course, there were some intellectuals within the Black community who said, well, we've been saying this for years. And so, they were grateful that a foreigner of such distinction had brought this issue to sort of national attention. And so, shortly after Dvorak arrived in September of 1892, and got involved in these discussions and was sort of learning about what makes Americans tick, Jubilee music had become very popular and had even entered into a kind of commercial marketplace that musicologists like Sandra Graham have written about recently. And he, as he was writing a new piece of music, decided that he would think about some of this as he was writing. And he had a student at the conservatory that he was leading. This was a vocal student and baritone vocalist named Harry Burleigh, who evidently sang frequently to Dvorak in his own home. And this music interested Dvorak. And there's quite a bit of informed speculation that the arrangement of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot that he sang for Dvorak was Ella Shepherd's arrangement. And as it turns out, Dvorak incorporated a little bit of this melody into the first movement of the New World Symphony. And so we can take a little listen to this moment in the symphony, thinking about the melody that we just heard of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and how Dvorak has transformed it a little bit through the voice of Burleigh into his symphonic imagination. So if we could go ahead and cue up the Dvorak Symphony first movement. So this melodic gesture, dee, 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 is directly out of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot in terms of its melodic shape. And when people heard this piece of music, it really inflamed people again on this idea of, they said, well, Dvorak would never stoop so low as to incorporate this music of enslaved people into a symphony. And so they denied its Americanness. They denied that that was even his inspiration. And throughout his career, Harry Burleigh spent quite a bit of time and effort correcting the record on this issue. But I think the point here is that this crisis moment posed by the end of the Civil War and the musical status of the recently freed slaves became, over time, a big conflict and flashpoint over the future of what American music would be, both in terms of the commercial realm and the classical realm. And so you see these moments of very heated discussion that sort of reveal the several sides of an argument, some of which reflected, extraordinarily racist attitudes, but then others that seem to be a bit more inclusive, as we would say today, where, it makes sense that Dvorak would come here and accept this music as authentically American and even be so interested in it that he would incorporate it into his own music. And so with that, I think I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Kernodle, for a second. If you wanted to say something about the commercialization of this music before we get into the second movement briefly.
Well, I think
so
it bears.
I was also going to also play the Largo for them in a second.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think, in talking about that intersection of Black music and consumerism, taking into consideration the time frame, you're talking about the post-Reconstruction years. We see as a variety of Black musicians operating in this level of entrepreneurship, from Ella Shepherd, who is transcribing these spiritual melodies and then creating a compendium of arrangements that is then sold as a songster as they tour the United States, and then seeing other Jubilee groups who emerge out of these historical Black colleges that began to proliferate during the post-Reconstruction years. But there's also that other point of popular music, which is also feeding into this idea of American music at the time of Dvorak, because at that time, we have the Chicago World's Fair, which provides the first platform for ragtime to emerge out of the insular environment, of Southern Blacks who have migrated during those Reconstruction years. And then how that ragtime tradition is finally tuned into a classical aesthetic through Scott Joplin and other composers, who thus then sell their music for consumption, right? Alongside Will Marion Cook, who is rescripting Broadway and the musical, the early musical theater paradigm, and shifting it, as Marva Carter has talked about in her work on Will Marion Cook, away from the minstrel show paradigm that was so popular in America at this time. So there is a level of Black entrepreneurship that is emerging out of this consumption of Black popular culture, as well as the classical aesthetic that is emerging as a result of Ella Shepherd, Harry T. Burleigh, the Fifth Jubilee Singers, and others.
Yeah, well, and I wasn't expecting this, but it's incredible that you mentioned Will Marion Cook, because, of course, he was also one of Dvorak's students at the conservatory and studied composition with him, but they didn't get along very well. And so you're right that Will Marion Cook went his own way, but this is a great segue into the Largo movement, because this is a melody that most people know. It's one of the most famous melodies, I think, in all of Western classical music. But many people know it also set to the words of Going Home. And there, historically at least, has been some confusion about whether this was a spiritual that Dvorak had heard and transcribed and kind of, put into this movement, or if it was his own melody. And the truth of the matter is that it was actually another of his students, another composition student of his named William Arms Fisher, who in 1926 published this piece under the title Going Home and sold it as part of the sheet music market for Negro spirituals at that time, which I'll talk about as soon as the excerpt is over. So if we could go ahead and cue up the second movement to the New World Symphony, we'll listen to that, and then I'll say a bit more about the time between the symphony and William Arms Fisher's arrangement. Thank you. Well, as I'm listening to this, what's going through my mind is that I think it's really incredible and provocative to think about how Ella Shepherd's arrangement of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot and Dvorak's New World Symphony, even though they're separated by a couple of decades, or at least Shepherd's start with the Jubilee Singers in the early 70s and Dvorak's Symphony being in 93, are in a way responses to the same crisis point in American history of the end of the Civil War. What does it mean to be American? What is the role of Black musicianship and music making? Is a question that continued throughout that 30 to 40 year period. Well, when I think about the period after Dvorak leaves, so he leaves in the year 1895, I think of the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s as kind of the a really robust sense of American imperialism, sort of trying to muscle our way into the international stage. 1898, 99 with the Spanish-American War, the kind of trumped up war, excuse the phrase there, no pun intended, but the trumped up war that caused a skirmish with Spanish government and involving Cuba and other sort of Spanish territories. But that was, in a sense, a part of our political ambition. And then I think of Teddy Roosevelt and sort of his love of nature and kind of westward expansion nearing its completion, but then of course the toll that took on Native Americans. So the sense of, you know, America's stature growing, but then the cost that comes with it is for me what defines this period right before the First World War. And what we see music-wise is, you know, really a sort of all of the above attitude among kind of music culture at large. This is also the period when we get the metaphor of the melting pot. I believe that came from a play that was written in 1908 called The Melting Pot. And it's this notion that Americans from every background are going to come together. This was a period of very large waves of immigration from places that were not the standard sources of immigrants to the United States. So we saw a lot more Eastern European immigrants, for example, Italian immigrants, as opposed to simply Western Europeans, like Irish and German, which had dominated earlier in the century. And so the types of people in the United States, kind of the demographic landscape is changing quite dramatically. And it again raises these questions of what does it mean to be American? Well, the popular music industry, and feel free to add your own take on this, Dr. Kernodle, but I think that the popular music industry exploited this to just a maximum degree. I mean, there were popular songs coming out of the Tin Pan Alley New York City publishing houses that comment on every single thing under the sun. I mean, and there's, you know, there are songs about Eastern Europeans marrying Italians and Italians marrying Irish. I mean, it's just sort of every issue that you could possibly think of becomes a source for popular music and entertainment. And of course, much of that continues through the First World War. I mean, you think about songwriters like Irving Berlin and George Cohan writing pieces that become associated with the war. And so popular music culture really explodes in a certain way during this time. And William Arms Fisher's arrangement of the Largo theme from Dvorak's New World Symphony is just yet another attempt to kind of exploit widespread American interest in the multicultural side of the nation's population. And there are, of course, some obvious moral problems with Fisher writing what he called a Negro spiritual as a white man. But I think that was part and parcel of everyone's attitude toward the commercial industry, that, you know, it was sort of like, if we can exploit it, we will. And so you see a lot of strange combinations along those lines that are very ethically problematic, but it really speaks to the kind of verve and just booming business within the commercial marketplace that allowed for some of these genres and ideas to flourish.
I think it also speaks, if I can say, to the type of appetite that Americans are developing as it relates to certain genres of popular culture. Because at the same time, we're experiencing the Great Migration, you know, which is a significant shift in population as, you know, hundreds of thousands of Southern Blacks are moving to these northern urban cities, but also are migrating southernly, you know, so they're moving intra-southernly, excuse me. So they're moving from these smaller towns to these larger southern cities as well, right? And the combination of these southern folk practices with these new urban environments are breeding, are sparking the development of new genres of music, right, that are framing this sense of modernity and this sense of American identity as we enter World War I and we come out of World War I, and we are dealing with the pandemic of 1918, the end of World War I and the carnage that created, and beginning to enter a decade that is initially defined by the rise of the middle class and this growing sense of wealth and opportunity, but is ultimately ended with the Great Depression, that will then permeate and ripple well into, the 1930s and 40s. But that appetite, that consumerism that you're talking about for ethnic culture, right? Um, and how the lines are beginning to blur because of this consumption of ethical, especially when I think of uh, the formulation of jazz migrating to these northern spaces, blues migrating to these northern spaces,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately what we get in a space like Chicago is that we get the blending of spiritual traditions, blues practices, and ultimately that gives birth to gospel music, right? Um, but that we also get a new idiom of jazz that is beginning to reflect the energy and the verve of these urban spaces that they're engaging with. The instrumentation is changing because of the audience changing, right? And so that we get these modern voices in the 1920s in the form of a Louis Armstrong, in the form
Mm-hmm.
of a Big Spiderbeck, in a form of Duke Ellington, who was they're part of these migrant cultures, and they're reconfiguring their identities and refiguring the sound of America, in these new spaces.
Yeah, and it's incredible to think about. Again, just a kind of an off-the-cuff connection here, but I remember Duke Ellington claimed that one of his greatest teachers, and I put this in quotation marks because it wasn't an official thing, but he said he learned more from Will Marion Cook than many other actual teachers. I think he kind of apprenticed with Cook for a little bit there.
Mm-hmm.
That said
Mm-hmm.
that he had a great influence. Well, to shift gears for a second back to the classical music industry during this time, um, and I know you're going to say more about this in a minute. It's incredible to think about, again, the Jim Crow laws that have come into full force
Mm-hmm.
during this period. And so there's a deeply segregated classical music industry where if you are a talented African American vocalist, for example, there are some venues that simply won't host you. There are many schools that simply won't accept you.
Mm-hmm.
Many conservatories did not accept any black students until the 1960s or later. So
Mm-hmm.
opportunities for studying classical music were in these sort of mainstream, or I even hesitate to use that word, but in the white predominant institutions was often a no-go. And so some of the HBCUs early on became training grounds for classical music. And some of the early teachers at HBCUs, I believe I've learned through the work of Kira Thurman, were German immigrants who had a sympathy for teaching anyone who came through their doors. And so they were working from time to time at the HBCUs, people of German ancestry. But in any case, the 1920s and 30s really posed challenges for trained musicians who wanted to work in the classical arena because they really relied on celebrity conductors or pianists or soloists on other instruments for their works to come out. And it wasn't, for the white composers, I don't want to say it was easy because it's never been easy to be a composer. But if you went to a conservatory and you were friends with someone who eventually became the conductor of an orchestra, you had a lot easier time making it as a composer because that individual would probably have the authority to program your works. But if you were denied entrance to a conservatory and did not make friends and developed a social network through organizations that were open only to white musicians, then you had a much harder time getting your work onto programs. And so the Great Depression really accentuated that. And now sort of everybody is struggling. The federal government steps in the mid 1930s with the Works Progress Administration and the Federal Music Project and tries to prop up a lot of musical ensembles. And, you know, I know that there's been some discussion about similar interventions from the federal government even today, given how badly the arts sector has been hit. But in any case, we have two musical examples that are very meaningful to me that we'll play here in just a second, because they articulate and bring together several of the strands that we've talked about so far. The first excerpt we have is a solo performance by the tenor Roland Hayes, who came to prominence through the assistance of Harry Burleigh, again, one of Dvorak's students at the conservatory. And he developed an international reputation as a singer, but he had a difficult time performing in the South. And so he had to be very careful about his performance routes and where he could go. But he also helped inaugurate a tradition of combining European art songs or arias on recitals with arranged spirituals. And he would often sing Burleigh's arrangements. He arranged some himself, and there are a couple of other arrangers that he would use. And so I want to start us off with this, the final verse to the spiritual Were You There, with Roland Hayes and his unique voice, trying to communicate as an artist, having grown up and experienced Jim Crow firsthand. So if we could go ahead and jump into the Hayes excerpt.
You there when they lay him in the tomb. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb?
Hayes intersects in significant ways with the composer of our next excerpt, who is Florence Price. And Florence Price, her life in many ways exemplified the migration patterns and other cultural aspects that we've been describing so far. She was born in 1887 in Little Rock, Arkansas. And as Jim Crow laws became clamped down on the ability of African Americans to move about freely, even in their own neighborhoods, she was rejected from high-level music training in the South and instead enrolled in New England Conservatory in Boston. But her mother felt that she had to enroll as someone of Mexican ancestry. She did have a little bit lighter complexion, and her mother believed that this would allow her greater safety in Boston. And she studied there for 3 years and was very prodigious. She finished 2 diplomas in those 3 years. And then she came back to the South and made her way as an instructor at African American academies of learning, kind of between high school and college level, and was eventually a music department chair at what's now Clark Atlanta University. Had a different name back then, I think just Clark University or maybe Clark College. But so she was there for a while working in that HBCU environment, and then finally moved back to Little Rock in 1910, eventually married a civil rights lawyer in 1912, and at that point, as a home caretaker, started a private studio for piano students and simply made her own way as an entrepreneur and wrote a lot of music for these students. Well, she did that for the next 15 years, but racial violence was so out of control by the mid to late 1920s that she and her family simply picked up and left as part of this great migration, and they settled in Chicago. Well, when she was there in Chicago, she became more active as a member of the National Association of Negro Musicians, which is a group that Dr. Kernodle kind of hinted at, became a sort of a way of sustaining Black musicianship outside of the confines of white institutions. And among her friends and supporters within this community, she wrote some of her first orchestral music. And her first symphony, which won a prize for Black composition, was premiered in 1933 by the Chicago Symphony, directed by Frederick Stock. And the connection to Hayes is that Roland Hayes also appeared as the vocal soloist at this concert on June 15th, 1933. And the entire performance was dedicated to showing off and publicizing the great achievements of African American musicians, including Hayes and Price. Now, Price's first symphony is becoming more well known, and I know that the Cincinnati Symphony performed Price's piano concerto earlier in the season. Last November, I was there. It was a really incredible performance. So I thought I would let our audience tonight hear a little bit of Price's Mississippi River Suite, which also includes some bits and pieces of quotations and reflections on the spirituals repertoire. And so what you're about to hear is a deeply colorful orchestral piece by Florence Price, an excerpt, and you'll hear some of these traces of the spiritual repertoire that have resonance, tying Price in the crisis moment of the Great Depression and the Great Migration, all the way back to the crisis moment that was facing African Americans at the end of the Civil War. So let's go ahead with the Mississippi River.
Yes, wonderful.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Kernodle.
Well, I was going to say, that Roland Hayes and Florence Price and what they achieved on the stage also corresponded with this period of significant violence, but also significant creative activity. Um, they are both representative of the emergence of the new Negro Renaissance, and really what the Negro Renaissance wanted to embody in terms of advancing a new sense of blackness, a black intellectual culture, of artistic culture. Um, but that Renaissance did not just happen in a vacuum. It goes back to your story about um, Florence Price and the decision to leave Arkansas to migrate to Chicago. And her decision was not unlike many others who sought to escape the South to move to the North. Um, we think of the period of 1917 to 1919, the amount of racial violence that's enacted on Black citizens in the United States intensifies. In 1919, it intensifies to the point that it is called the Red Summer, because you have one of the largest outbreaks of race riots or insurrections that take place throughout the United States. And many of those moments of violence took place in the North, a North that had been envisioned by that generation that migrated at the start of World War One as the promised land. And that promised land proved to be anything but this place of sanctuary, this place of equality. And so while Jim Crow may not have been governing uh, the North in the same way that it did, in a very physical way, from the signs to the laws and the provisions that were put in place in southern states, uh, individuals like Florence Price and Roland Hayes, and also their peer William Grant Steele, were very aware of um, of the segregation and the lack of opportunities that the North presented. So when we look at 1919, we see this violence that is taking place across the land, but we also see this movement emerging to use art as a conduit for facilitating a discussion about equality and opportunity and access. And so, if possible, if I would like to transition to Florence Price's peer, William Grant Steele, who uh, along with Florence Price and William Dawson, helped really establish the Black symphonist tradition, and in many ways came to embody what was Dvorak's call in 1892, because he situated that nationalistic style as being defined in the cultivation of a repertoire of symphonies and operas, but but Black composers could not, uh, in many ways, manifest that particular charge or call because they did not have uh, access to European styled orchestras. And so here we have in Steele and Florence Price and William Dawson the realization of that American aesthetic. African American composers realizing their place in this American aesthetic. Still producing the Afro American Symphony in 1932. We then get Florence Price's Symphony Number 1 in E minor, William Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony, 1934. These embodying how African Americans hear themselves in this context of an American classical aesthetic. But I want to point to to the point of 7 years after the piece that you played, which William Grant Still is emerging as this kind of poignant voice in terms of addressing what are these larger social political fights that African Americans are engaged in this period. In 1940, he began collaborating with Catherine Garrison Chapin, who was a well-known poet and lecturer and activist. And she wrote a poem entitled "And They Lynched Him on a Tree." And Alain Locke, who is the one of the architects of the Negro Renaissance or the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro Movement, whatever your terminology you want to use, brought together William Grant Still and Chapin in hopes that they would collaborate on a larger project to turn this play into a piece. And so Still, who at that point in time was very cognizant of the lack of opportunities that race oftentimes positioned in terms of the careers of Black composers and Black performers, thought that it was necessary for him to lend his voice and to lend his cultural currency to openly talking about lynching. Now, I want us to think about this culturally. You have William Grant Still writing this piece, which he calls a choral ballad, that is for 2 choruses, for a narrator, for a soprano, soloist, and orchestra. 1 year after we hear Billie Holiday record Strange Fruit. So we have 2 different conversations about something that has become endemic, embedded into the social fabric of America at that time, lynching, that direct terrorism. And so you've got, in some ways, Billie Holiday offering us this kind of outsider point of view, this narration of these southern trees that bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. But we have William Grant Still in the piece "They Lynched Him and They Lynched Him on a Tree," offering a multi-directional look at lynching and what lynching means. And this is very timely because when we think about the iconography of America at this point in time, one of the common images that is brought up are those images that come from lynchings during this period. Those images were disseminated on postcards. They became a part of the fabric of America and how America sought to deal with part of its citizenry. And so you have William Grant Still envisioning the white crowd and their perceptions on the lynching of this person. And they are represented by one chorus. The second chorus represents the Black community and them experiencing and detailing the aftermath of this lynching. But Still also gives us a voice that we have not heard in this conversation, because he situates in between these 2 choruses the Black mother, the Black woman, and her relating what was this life of this individual who is nameless, who is faceless, but has been lynched, right? As an example of what happens when one does not subscribe to their respective place, when individuals take it upon themselves to think that they are the arbiters of justice. This is not unlike what we have seen, in particular in recent times, in recent months, so to speak, even today with the footage of the young man who died at the hands of Minneapolis police officers, right? And so that's a different type of lynching, but we have William Grant Still invoking a conversation in the concert hall where individuals may have never heard Billie Holiday. We have William Grant Still offering us a different perspective of what is a salient part of Black life in America, no matter if you're in the South, North, East, or West during this period. So can we cue up, there's two examples, but for the sake of time, I only want to play the one example, the second example of the Black chorus, so that we can hear a little bit of this piece.
They took away his freedom in the name of the law, but justice was a slow thing to be waiting for. Justice was too slow, the white men said, so they got together when the sun was high. They marched to the jail and broke it through the cell and caught the prisoner to drag him out to die. They dragged him on his knees and they lynched him on the tree. And they left him hanging for the world to see. Justice was a slow thing to be waiting for. In the false name of justice, they broke the law. Oh, my Jesus, where is your hand? They've taken this boy to a dark land. He did wrong, but could they let him be? Not die like this on a roadside tree.
And so we have, William Grant Still at this time, adding to this larger growing voice of artists and artisans that are becoming a part of what is a progressive political environment, particularly in New York, although still 1 year before this, has moved to LA. I just want to say one thing, because this piece debuted on a program that included Paul Robeson singing spirituals, but him also singing the iconic piece Ballad for Americans. And as you were saying earlier, Dr. Shadle, about this conversation about what it meant to be American, right, at the turn of the century, and how all of these identities are being evoked. It's quite poignant to think that on an afternoon concert in 1940 that you're hearing these two counterpoints, right? Ballad for Americans, who is talking about all of this, invoking all of this American history and mythology, right? And even within the spectrum of the multiculturalism of our immigrant population and our religious identities, and then to have on the other side of that still presenting this very poignant work about lynching, and lynching being viewed from the standpoint of the white crowd that is a part of this activity, the mother who is talking about what was this lived life and this lived experience with this child, and the Black community then dealing with the carnage and the aftermath of this.
Yeah, well, and am I right that this it was premiered by the New York Philharmonic, correct? Is that
Mhm, mhm,
is that right?
mhm,
Yeah, you know, it's just incredible to me that it was at this stadium concert by the New York Philharmonic. You know, and not to throw the Philharmonic under the bus, but you know, we often think of major orchestras today being completely divorced from
mhm,
politics, but this was the
mhm,
Philharmonic, I believe, conducted by Arthur Rochinski, who was their star conductor in the same way that Frederick Stott conducted Price. Um, you know, it makes me think kind of to zoom ahead to the present, um, what arts organizations do now to respond to a crisis. And you know, I should tell our listeners that Dr. Kernodle and I planned to talk about the post-World War II period, and kind of how complicated and eclectic it was. But we're running short on time a little bit, and I would just encourage anyone who has a question to ask about that. But I think you know, where I am at this point in the conversation is that maybe some of you were thinking we would talk about music that's a direct response to World War I, for example, or a direct response to World War II. And the question that I'm left with as we think about music in crisis is whose crisis is it?
mm.
Who
Yes.
who gets to avoid feeling the full effects of a crisis, and who feels it most pointedly? And in some cases that we've talked about, we've seen how minoritized populations have been vulnerable to certain types of crises that dominant groups have not been subject to. And, you know, my fear, as we've seen in the news, is that some of this is already happening again with the pandemic. And I know that's kind of a down note uh, to leave on, but I know that Dr. Kernodle has planned another more hopeful message, and our final excerpt, which we certainly have to play, is more hopeful. And I'll let her introduce it a bit more, but I want to say one thing to connect it to my strand of thinking is that this is another spiritual, and it was arranged by the composer and pianist Margaret Bonds, who also appeared on the 1933 program with the Chicago Symphony with Florence Price and Roland Hayes. She was a piano soloist for John Alden Carpenter's very difficult concertino, and I believe she was only about 19 years old, and by all accounts did very well with it. And I recently saw one review that said she was recalled to the stage 6 times. Um, and so this was really an incredible moment in her life. So Dr. Kernodle, I'll pass it over to you to give us a final message and how we can think about this crisis that we're currently in, how we get out, and you know what hope there is that lies before us.
Okay. So I'd like to say, to add to your talk about your discussion of Margaret Bonds, Bonds as a protege of Florence Price really served as a bridge to what was the aesthetic of the new Negro generation composer of Steele and Price and Dawson, and what was the emerging generation of composers that would align themselves with the Black civil rights struggle in the late 1960s. And so she was very key in helping advance the spiritual um, in a new idiom, thinking of the spiritual in a more modernist form, um, really reflecting musically, especially in her use of harmonies, the influence that gospel and jazz, which had been so much a part of the soundscape of Chicago during her formative years, had an influence upon her. But one of the things that was key to Margaret Bonds' advancement of the spiritual was her relationship with Black female concert artists. And in particular, Leontine Price commissioned uh, Margaret Bonds to write a series of spiritual arrangements for her in the 1960s. And one of the most iconic arrangements that she created was of the spiritual. He's got the whole world in his hands. And I chose this example because I think that in this time, in this moment, where we have all been directly impacted and touched by COVID-19 and its impact on our world from a personal crisis point, but also from an economic point, and now as it's being used as a political football that is destined to separate us. I want to remind us that we should not lose hope. I want to remind us that what this virus has revealed to us is that we are all the same. It doesn't matter if we're rich or poor, if we're Black or white or Asian or Latinx, European or American. It has not mattered whether we are straight or gay or trans or bi or educated or uneducated, employed or unemployed. This virus is not in any way been able to be stopped by any of these factors that we often use to divide us. In this moment, I do want to remind us to not lose hope, that our music, as people continue to sing and play in this virtual format, as we continue to look to the arts, I want to just remind you of the power of transcendence that is often found in this music and the spirit of perseverance that often emanates from this music. So we're going to end with Margaret Bonds' setting of He's Got the Whole World in His Hand, sung by famed soprano Angela Brown.
Well, thank you both very much. It's hard to follow that with anything else, but I do want to turn to our questions from the listeners who've been following along so beautifully. Let's start with a question for Dr. Kernodle. Stephen is asking, how were Ella Shepherd's arrangements transmitted? Were they transmitted through an oral tradition or through notation?
So initially they were translated in oral tradition, but being a trained musician, she began to transcribe those um, spiritual melodies down, and so those arrangements lived on in a published, circulated form of songsters. Um, in fact, I should have included the image of them. You can actually find the songs of the Fifth Jubilee Singers, and I do believe Sandra Graham is preparing a edited edition of one of the versions of the Fifth Jubilee songsters in a future project called Sound and Spirit. So shout out to Sandra and that work. So yeah.
And
Yeah,
a
yeah. And
oh, please go ahead, Doug.
yeah, sorry, Matthew. I would just add quickly that, at the same time, there was always the recognition that notated music never actually captures every nuance of performance. And so even though some of these were captured in notation, um, there was still a performance practice tradition that was handed down orally. And I know that Harry Burleigh, as a vocalist, was very particular about performance practice, even in addition to creating more authentic arrangements. And so in a certain sense, it's a both and in terms of how the music is transmitted. I mean, if we think of it as, a song, then there is absolutely this notated tradition that comes out of oral tradition. But then how to perform it, it adds a whole other layer of complication to kind of that question and issue.
A follow-up question from Bill. Do you happen to know if there are any Cincinnati landmarks to visit in regard to Ella Shepherd, or places to know in general about her time in Cincinnati, Dr. Kernodle?
I've been trying to uncover that history. I've heard rumors that one of her teachers was actually located in Glendale, Ohio, um, which is a community just north of Cincinnati. Um, but it's really hard to pinpoint exactly um, where she was living at that period in time. I think they moved a few times because of her father's death and not being able to remain in the home that he established with them. Because once all his debts were paid, the family found itself penniless. So Ella Shepherd is one of the topics in which I'm looking to expand my knowledge of even more, especially her connection to this city.
Great, we'll stay tuned for that. Dr. Shadle, a question for you from Lou. If you could influence arts organizations today, what would you suggest they do to respond to the current crisis?
Well, do we want to go for another hour, Matthew? No, I, I actually think there's a rather simple answer to this question, as complex as things seem right now. And it's for arts organizations to consider who it is that they actually serve. Who am I actually trying to reach and serve? And focus with laser-like focus on that. Arts organizations are by definition community organizations. As nonprofit organizations, they're service organizations and service and mission driven. And I think for arts organizations to come out of, I mean, obviously there are finances to deal with, but I think the solution to financial problems is to focus with laser-like intensity on the people you serve. Not have some kind of abstract idea of what's great about art and all of this, but to think about the people who you're actually reaching. And this is something that I think a lot of organizations should have been doing prior to the crisis. And to put a little bit of a cynical spin on it, it's sort of like now that there aren't audiences to serve anymore, people are wondering, well, what do we do? Well, again, to bring it back to basics, it's to serve the people around you. So to figure out who those people are, how you can connect what you are able to offer with their needs and desires as a community, I think is really the fundamental number one. And again, it would take me, days and essays to go into the specifics, but this community focus is just absolutely essential in rethinking what that means.
Absolutely. A question for both of you from Steve. Other than the examples that you shared, what are some key pieces of American music that you think everyone should listen to?
Ooh, well, um, I think that everyone should hear Duke Ellington's Black, Brown, and Beige. I think that is an important piece um, in terms of framing what is an American experience. I akin it to as being a significant counterpart to William Grant Still's Afro-American Symphony and Florence Price's Symphony Number One and the Negro Folk Spiritual Symphony. Excuse me. I think if you listen to those symphonic works from that period in time, that's a great place to start. I also really believe that jazz-wise, there are certain pieces of American music in that realm that people should listen to. I think everyone should hear Charles Mingus's Fabus of Fabus, the Haitian fight dance. Uh, uh, I think Mary Lou's Mass and her Zodiac Suite are very important. The coupling of Black, Brown, and Beige and the Zodiac Suite are so important and central to understanding how America's concert hall is being reshaped and redefined sonically in mid-century America. And I think her jazz masters from the 70s, 60s and 70s, particularly Mary Lou's Mass, provides us a glimpse of how civil rights and religion and jazz intersect in that period in time. And I think it's a piece that represented a significant effort to invoke healing of that time during that period in time that has also universally spanned it into our current day. And that's a very hard question, and it's an unfair question. But and I'm going to probably people are going to probably be upset with me for not naming others, but those are the immediate ones that come to my mind.
Dr.
Yeah,
Shadle, how about for you?
yeah, just very quickly, to sort of riff on a composer that we had queued up to play is the composer George Walker. Most classical music fans know Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings. George Walker wrote a piece shortly thereafter, after his grandmother died, talk about responding to a crisis called Lyric for Strings. It's absolutely stunning. It's stunningly beautiful. And it's a piece that Riccardo Muti, incidentally, of all conductors, has championed. So there are a couple of great recordings that he's done, but there are some other recordings too. But George Walker's Lyric for Strings is outstanding. The living composer Nkeru Okoye, who I believe is living in Ann Arbor right now, has just an incredible opera that tells aspects of the Harriet Tubman story. It's called Harriet Tubman. And I would just encourage anyone who's an opera fan to expand their ears outward with that piece. It's also based in a certain sense on the spiritual repertoire, but just every other kind of music as well. And it's such a gripping piece of drama that I would just highly recommend that you seek that out. And there's a full recording of that, I believe, on YouTube, the Harriet Tubman opera.
Great. A question from Megan for Dr. Kernodle. How much money would one have earned by selling pieces of music back in the late 1800s? Was that a good living?
Well, I think Scott Joplin provides us a great example of someone who was able to make a considerable amount of money with his publications, and we know that that he did amass a nice fortune, one that allowed him to take time once he moved to New York in the early 1900s to suspend writing rags and waltzes and piano works to work on his opera Tremonisha. Ultimately, his debts became too much, but he made considerable fortune. I think the appetite for Black popular music in the form of ragtime and jazz afforded Black musicians an ability to have certain amount of agency that they could not have possibly, had in the classical realm. Now there are some exceptions, but I do think that Scott Joplin and what his music amasses in terms of popularity, Will Marion Cook's songs from his musicals as well, provide us a glimpse of how Black musicians were able to achieve a certain status economically during that period.
Yeah, and
For
if
Dr.
I'm, well,
Please go
if
ahead.
I may, Matthew, yeah, I would just add that I would say I mean, Scott Joplin, in a certain sense, is the exception that proves the rule, and that for many people, both Black and white, and even other ethnicities, if you wanted to be a professional musician in the late 19th century, you really had to do everything. Hyper specialization that we see even in the early 20th century wasn't that economically viable. And so you find people who play organ or piano at church, they direct choirs, they write music for these groups, they sell some popular songs, they compose string quartets and try to get those published in the marketplace. And so being a musician, you could make a very good living. You also had to kind of get lucky and strike down the right path. But a lot of musicians did many different musical tasks during this period. And of course, kind of depending on where you live, your ability to specialize could be hampered. The smaller the town that you're in, the more you become the town musician who has to do everything musical. So that's kind of my spin on it.
We have time for one more question. This one comes to us from Susan, a question for both of you. What modern composers do you consider to be the fresh voices who are shaping American music of the future? Let's go to Dr. Shadle first.
Sure. I'm not sure how young or old you want me to go, but I think one of the most vital voices in American music today is the composer Gabriella Lena Frank. She's a Californian composer who has multi-ethnic roots, both from Eastern Europe and South America. And she's someone who, throughout her career, has thought deeply about the relationship between the confluence of cultures and how that can be expressed musically. And I find many of her works to be very compelling, but also the way that she thinks about composition and its relationship to the environment and climate change, for instance. She created her own composition academy in Boonville, California, where she mentors young composers outside of standard institutional frameworks. And so I see Gabriella Frank as just one of the most significant forces in American music today, simply because she is really hitting on many different angles at once, both in her own compositions, but also how she pays it forward to other individuals.
And Dr. Kernodle, a new voice or fresh voice in contemporary American music that we should be listening for?
I think you should be listening for Courtney Bryan, who is on the faculty of Tulane, who has done some wonderful things in advancing the spirituals, but also the concept of spiritual music. I think she's a fresh voice. I also think that Mark Lomax II, who has advanced very eclectic styles from jazz to concert music and classical form. And I point specifically to his work, the 400 Suite, where he commemorates 1619 and the arrival of Africans. He did a series of albums, 12 albums, all of them in different mediums and forms, that really shows the real breadth of his compositional voice and his ability as a percussionist as well. So those two people immediately come to my mind, Courtney Bryan and Mark Lomax II.
Excellent. Unfortunately, there's so much more to say, but I'm afraid we're coming up on our time here. And on that note, I wish to thank both Dr. Kernodle and Dr. Shadle for your insightful and enlightening presentation tonight. And I thank all of you at home for joining us. Now that we are armed with some historical perspective, we hope you'll return this coming Friday evening, May 29th at 7 p.m., as a panel of Cincinnati's leading voices in the performing and vocal arts discusses the way forward for us here in the city that sings. and you can return on Saturday evening to hear excerpts from my conversation with the composer and 2020 May Festival artistic partner, John Adams. For more information and for the full schedule of live events, visit mayfestival.com. On behalf of our guests tonight, I'm Matthew Swanson from Music Hall. Keep singing.